I'm Abigail Riley. I was 26 years old the day my chest locked up so tight I couldn't pull air into my lungs. I was standing in the kitchen, gripping the counter, trying not to fall over when my dad said, "Quit faking it," and turned away. I was shaking with effort, not fear, and every breath felt like it might be my last. My aunt rolled her eyes and said, "I was just trying to get out of cleanup duty." That's when my sister Jenny finally raised her voice and said something no one else in the family had ever dared. She said, "I wasn't faking," she said. "Something was really wrong, and just like that, the room changed before I go any further. Let me know where you're listening from in the comments, and if you've ever had to fight just to be believed. Tap that like and subscribe button. It helps more than you know." Growing up in the Riley household meant one thing above all else: never let them see weakness. My father, Frank, ran both his construction crew and our family with the same steel backbone. He was tall, hard-handed, and never short on opinions. He'd grown up in the kind of home where working through pain was a badge of honor, and talking about feelings was a sign you weren't tough enough. My mother, Laura, softened those edges when she was alive. She died when I was 4. And after that, things were different. Aunt Marcia came around more. She was Dad's older sister and carried herself like a woman who never left the house without full makeup and an agenda. Her version of love came in the form of comments like, "Maybe that dress isn't doing you any favors," or "Don't eat that. If you want to wear those jeans next week." I used to think maybe that was just how families talk to each other. But the older I got, the less it felt like care, and the more it felt like control. My little sister Jenny was the only one who saw me, even when no one else did. She was 3 years younger and always quieter than me, but steady. Where I wavered whenever I got a migraine or came down with something, she'd slip into my room with water and a cool cloth and sit with me in the dark. She never said much, just stayed close, but it mattered more than she ever knew when I was 13 and running a fever. The morning of a big math test, I begged Dad to let me stay home. He told me I was just looking for an excuse and made me go. I threw up in the middle of the exam, but still got a lecture for embarrassing the family. By the time I was 16, I had learned to keep my mouth shut about pain or anything that might be seen as weakness. I stopped saying when something hurt. Stopped asking to rest, pushed through everything with gritted teeth, because that was the only way to survive. In a house where sympathy was scarce when I got accepted to college out of state. It felt like freedom. 4 years of being believed. When I said I was tired or sick of professors who listened, and roommates who brought soup without judgment. After graduation, I stayed in the city, took a job in marketing, and made a quiet life for myself I called home on. Holidays visited when I had to, but kept a healthy distance. Then the economy dipped, and our firm let go of half the team. I was one of the newest hires and one of the first to go. I held on for 3 months, scraping by on savings and freelance work, but eventually there was nothing left to cover. Rent! Dad said I could stay in the apartment above the garage, rent-free, until I got back on my feet. Jenny was happy to have me home, and even Marcia mentioned a few people at her country club who might be hiring. So I packed up and came back, swallowing a lump of dread that had nothing to do with the move and everything to do with the history. I was walking back into the 4th of July was a big deal in our family. Every year we hosted a cookout that ended with fireworks on the hill behind our house, Dad said. Since I was living there now, I could handle hosting this year. He meant it as an order, not a suggestion. Jenny offered to help, but most of it fell on me. The cleaning, the planning, the shopping. It felt like walking a tightrope over old expectations and new pressure. And the more I tried to do things right, the more I felt something was off. By the time the guests arrived and the folding chairs were lined up across the lawn, I was already lightheaded. I hadn't eaten since breakfast, and the ache in my leg had become a steady throb. But I smiled through it all like I always had. No one knew that each step I took felt like I was wading through water, and no one knew that each breath was starting to feel just a little too shallow by the morning of July 3rd. The pain in my leg had sharpened into something I couldn't ignore, Every time I bent to lift something, it throbbed deep and hot behind my knee, but there were still groceries to unpack, lawn chairs to wipe down, and tablecloths to iron. I kept telling myself it was just the way I'd slept, or maybe a strained muscle from scrubbing the deck the night before. That's what I'd always done. Ignored the signals, tried to get through it. One task at a time when I sat down to rest. My breathing felt shallow, like I was only using half my lungs. I brushed it off as stress. I hadn't slept well. And the to-do list was longer than the daylight hours. Jenny came by with extra coolers and saw me slumped on the bottom step of the porch. Catching my breath, she tilted her head but didn't press. Maybe she knew I wouldn't answer. Honestly, the morning of the 4th started heavy, even before the sun was all the way up. I felt like I was moving through water, just showering. Left me dizzy and out of breath. I grabbed the edge of the sink and waited for my balance to catch up. It never quite did. Still, I had a house to prepare and a family to host by mid-morning. I was hanging streamers and setting the tables out back. The heat settled in thick and damp, making the air harder to take in. But I told myself I just needed more water, or maybe some protein. It didn't occur to me that something much worse was already at work inside me. Jenny showed up early with a bag of ice and that look on her face, the one that meant she knew I was running on fumes. "You don't look good," she said, her voice low. I told her it was just the heat, that I was fine. Even as a sharp pressure squeezed my chest, when I lifted one of the heavy coolers she offered to take over, and I said no. If Dad saw me resting, he'd say I was slacking. If Marcia saw it, she'd say I was playing helpless. People started arriving around 2. Uncle Robert and his wife came with their kids. Then a couple of Dad's cousins pulled into the driveway. Jenny helped set out the food while I moved from group to group, smiling and handing out drinks. My hands felt strange, like they didn't quite belong to me, and I had to remind myself to keep breathing deep and slow. Marcia showed up last as usual, stepping through the back gate like she owned the place. She glanced at the decorations, then turned her gaze on me with a dramatic sigh. "Abigail, you look like you haven't slept in a week. Are you going for the pale and tragic look today?" I didn't answer, just took her casserole dish and pointed her toward the buffet table. We all sat down to eat a little before 4. The backyard was crowded with folding chairs and paper plates and the smell of grilled chicken. I pushed food around on my plate, barely eating. Dad leaned over and muttered, "If you're going to make a show of hosting, you could at least act like you want to be here." I nodded, picked up a fork, took a bite just to make the conversation stop. My chest hurt with every breath, and a tingle had started in my fingers, the kind you get when you sleep on your arm too long. I kept smiling, answering questions about work, pretending everything was fine even when my vision blurred around the edges. After dessert, Dad clapped his hands and told everyone Jenny and I would handle cleanup, while the rest of them moved to the front lawn to set up for fireworks. I stayed seated a moment too long, and Jenny looked at me with concern. Again, "You sure you're okay?" I told her. "Yes." Stood up and forced my body into motion in the kitchen. We started clearing plates and packing leftovers into containers. The overhead lights buzzed, louder than usual, or maybe that was just the way the world sounded. Now my calf was cramping so bad I had to shift my weight every few seconds. The counter seemed farther away than it should have been, and when I bent to load the dishwasher, the pain in my chest came back sharp enough to steal my breath. The plates in my hands slipped. I tried to catch them, but my arms didn't move fast enough. They shattered across the tile floor with a crash that seemed to echo through the house. Dad came in a second later, his jaw clenched and his eyes wide with anger. "What the hell? Abigail, those were your mother's dishes," he barked. I opened my mouth to speak, but no air came out. My chest tightened like a rope had been pulled across it. I couldn't inhale. My hand flew to the center of my ribs. "I can't breathe," I whispered. Or maybe I just mouthed it. I wasn't sure. He shook his head. Quit faking it. Clean up this mess and get back to work." Marcia stepped in behind him, arms crossed, really Abigail trying to get out of, trying to clean up duty with a performance. "This obvious. This is a new low even for you." Jenny moved fast. She was at my side in a heartbeat, saying something to Dad, but I couldn't catch it. I was sliding down the cabinets, trying to hold on to something to stay upright. The kitchen spun and all the faces blurred into one pale shape. Jenny's voice rose above the noise. "She's not faking it. Look at her." Uncle Robert came in from the hallway. His face changed when he saw me crumpled on the floor, knees pulled up trying to get enough air. "Maybe we should call someone," he said slowly. Dad hesitated, said, "She's fine. She just needs to calm down." But his voice wavered. I heard the sound of a phone unlocking. Jenny saying the words we'd never said in that house. "I'm calling 911. Dad tried to stop her, but she backed away. "Don't you dare," she said, her hand shaking. Aunt Marcia muttered something about the embarrassment of it all, but Jenny was already talking to the dispatcher. Her words sharp and clear. "My sister can't breathe. She's conscious but barely. She's 26. The kitchen ceiling tilted again. The corners of my vision closed in. Jenny knelt beside me, holding my hand, telling me help was coming. Grandmother Irene appeared, then quietly pushing people aside and kneeling down. Despite her stiff joints, she took my other hand and said something steady and low. I couldn't hear it, but I knew she meant it. Sirens cut through the late afternoon air loud and getting closer, the room filled with motion people stepping back, the front door swinging open fast. Footsteps, heavy boots, voices asking questions I couldn't answer. A young paramedic knelt beside me, took my wrist and shouted for the stretcher. His voice was the last thing I heard before everything went black. The sound of the sirens seemed far away, even as the paramedics lifted me from the kitchen floor. Jenny stayed close, answering questions about what had happened, how long the symptoms had lasted, and whether I had any known conditions. Someone adjusted a mask over my face, and the sudden rush of oxygen made everything spin. The lights above me flickered in and out as they moved me through the house and out to the waiting ambulance inside the rig. The noise softened into beeping monitors and clipped voices. One of the EMTs held my wrist, watching the numbers rise and fall as he called something into a radio. I felt Jenny's hand in mine, though I couldn't turn my head to see her. I heard her voice low and steady, saying my name over and over, asking me to hang on. She sounded scared, but she didn't let go. The rest came in pieces, ceiling lights passing overhead, pressure at my chest, a second mask being fitted, someone calling out numbers, blood pressure, oxygen level, something about heart rate. Everything felt heavy, like I was floating through the room without touching anything. The emergency room was loud and bright. The shift from the ambulance to the hospital bed made my chest ache. A woman leaned over me with a pen light, asking if I could hear her. I blinked once and tried to nod. Her name was Dr. Winters, and she said they were going to help me, that I was safe now. They worked quickly, attaching more wires, placing monitors, starting fluids. Someone held an ultrasound wand to my leg, pressing gently against the muscle, then pointing at a screen DVT. She said to another nurse, "Blood clot." The words barely registered. They wheeled me to another room, a scanner humming around me while I tried to keep still. A voice told me to hold my breath, then breathe, then hold again. I did my best to follow along, but the tightness in my chest made it hard to obey commands. When we returned to the main area, things moved even faster. More hands, more voices, more machines. One of the doctors leaned close and said they were going to help me breathe better, but first they needed to sedate me. I couldn't answer. I just closed my eyes and let the dark come in. I woke up sometime later with Jenny still at my side, her face drawn and tired, but her hand still wrapped around mine. The room was quiet. the beeping of monitors, the hum of machines, the faint scent of antiseptic. She smiled when she saw me awake and reached for a cup of water. My throat burned, and I could barely speak. She explained. I'd been intubated, that the clot had traveled to my lungs and blocked several arteries. The medical term was pulmonary embolism, and according to the doctors, it had been serious enough to nearly kill me. Dr. Winters came in later and filled in the rest. She explained how a blood clot had formed in my leg and broken free, traveling through my body until it lodged in my lungs, cutting off oxygen and stressing my heart. They'd performed a procedure to break up the clots and started me on blood thinners, she said. The next few days would be important for monitoring complications. Jenny stayed for all of it, asking questions when I couldn't focusing on every answer. The nurses were gentle. They checked my vitals, adjusted the machines, and explained each step. They treated me like I mattered, like my pain had weight, like I wasn't imagining it later that day. Jenny told me Dad had come to the hospital. He'd followed the ambulance in his truck with Grandma Irene and Marcia. She said he sat in the waiting room for hours, pacing, asking for updates, barely speaking to anyone. Marcia had left not long after arriving, said. The stress was too much for her Uncle Robert. Stayed with them, kept Grandma company, and made sure Dad didn't forget to eat. He even called the rest of the family to let them know what had happened. Jenny said he was the only one who didn't try to make excuses for what I'd gone through. I drifted in and out over the next few hours, sometimes waking to new faces, new voices, checking monitors, adjusting settings. One of the nurses stayed a little longer than the rest. She told me to speak up if I was in pain. That pain wasn't weakness. It was information they needed to help me, she said. A lot of people, especially women, were taught to ignore their symptoms, but that kind of thinking could be dangerous. Her words settled somewhere deep in my chest, not just because they were kind, but because they were true. I'd spent most of my life doing exactly that, brushing off warning signs, hiding pain, trying to prove I wasn't the dramatic one. In the afternoon, Jenny brought my phone and showed me the messages that had come in. Friends from college, co-workers, even neighbors from my old building had heard I was in the hospital and reached out. Their concern was real, their words gentle. No one accused me of exaggerating or making a scene. There was a quiet knock at the door, and Dad stepped inside. He looked older somehow, like the hours had stretched across his face. His eyes moved from the machines to the oxygen line to the band around my wrist, and finally landed on me. He asked how I was feeling. I said, better. It was the truth, but it didn't cover everything. He stayed for a few minutes, talked about the weather and the hospital cafeteria, then stood and said he'd be back later. Before he left, he paused at the door, said he was glad I was okay, then walked out. Jenny came back in a few minutes later, said he'd been like that all day, quiet, restless, not quite sure where to stand. Dr. Winters came by again that evening, said she wanted to arrange a meeting with the family before I was discharged. She explained that pulmonary embolism was serious and recovery would take time. It wasn't just the procedure or the medication. It was how the people around me understood what I'd been through and how they responded going forward. She said it was important that they hear the facts from someone who could explain them clearly. I nodded, not sure what to expect, but knowing something had to change. 2 days after I woke up in the ICU, Dr. Winters met with me again. She sat in the chair beside my bed, holding a clipboard, and explained what recovery would look like, the medication schedule, follow-up visits, possible side effects. She walked through everything, slowly pausing when I looked, confused or asked questions. Then she said something that made me sit up straighter. She wanted to have a meeting with my family before I was discharged. She said it plainly, not unkind but firm, that people who dismissed medical symptoms didn't always mean harm, but it could have consequences. This wasn't just about one event. This was about learning to respond differently. Next time, she said the goal wasn't to assign blame, it was to make sure it never happened again. My dad was the first to arrive. He stood near the window, hands in his pockets, barely looking at the bed. Jenny walked in with Grandma Irene close behind. Uncle Robert came too, carrying a folder under one arm. Aunt Marcia followed last, adjusting her cardigan and glancing around like the hospital room was beneath her. Dr. Winters introduced herself again and then laid everything out. The clot had formed in my leg and traveled to my lungs. The blockage had nearly stopped oxygen from reaching my bloodstream. My heart had struggled to build. Compensate my condition was labeled critical, and had we waited any longer, the outcome might have been different. No one spoke for a moment. Then Grandma let out a soft sound, almost like a sigh. Dr. Winters continued, explaining how symptoms like chest pain or shortness of breath should never be ignored. She said she'd seen too many cases where a delay cost someone their life, and that, in my case, the decision to call 911 had made all the difference. Dad shifted in his seat. He rubbed a hand over his chin and muttered, "How are we supposed to know we're not doctors?" Dr. Winters kept her voice even. "You're not expected to diagnose," she said. "But when someone says they can't breathe, the right thing to do is believe them and get help." The room fell quiet again. Grandma looked down at her hands folded in her lap. Jenny sat beside me and gave my arm a small squeeze. Marcia crossed her arms and stared at the floor. Uncle Robert nodded slowly, his face drawn when the doctor finished and stepped out the silence. Stretched. I looked at each of them, unsure where to begin. Then I spoke not loudly but clearly. "I told you I couldn't breathe." I said it more than once and nobody believed me. Jenny did, but the rest of you thought I was faking or making it up again. No one moved. Dad looked down, then back up. His mouth opened, then closed. Marcia spoke first, her voice crisp and cool. No one could have known it was that serious. "You've always been sensitive." I sat up straighter. "I nearly died," I said it calmly, but the words landed heavy. Marcia didn't reply. She stood up and left the room without another word. The door clicked shut behind her. Dad stared at the door a moment, then turned back toward me. "We're not mind readers, Abigail. How are we supposed to know this time was different?" "You weren't," I said. "You were supposed to believe me. That's what parents are supposed to do. Believe their kids when they say they're in pain." The words hung in the air between us, quiet but solid. He stood slowly, walked to the window, and stared. Out toward the parking lot, Grandma spoke next. Her voice thin but steady. "She's right, Frank. We failed her, and I did too after your mother passed. You didn't know how to handle your grief, so you taught the girls not to show theirs. That wasn't fair to either of them." Jenny reached for her purse and pulled out a small notebook. She flipped it open and started reading, the time I had. Strep throat, and was sent to school anyway. The ankle I twisted at 13. That wasn't x-rayed for days. The migraines, the infections, the ignored fevers. She had written them all down. I didn't even know. Uncle Robert leaned forward. "I knew some of it," he said, "but not all." I should have spoken up sooner. "Abigail, I'm sorry for that." I nodded, not sure what to say. It was more than anyone else had offered. Dad turned from the window. Slowly, I did what I thought was best. I was trying to raise you to be strong. You taught me to doubt myself instead, I said. And it almost killed me. He didn't respond, not right away. Then he walked out. The door without a word, Grandma let out a breath and looked at me. "He'll come around," she said softly, but she didn't sound sure. "I don't know if I can wait," I answered. "Not this time." "You shouldn't have to," Jenny said. "You didn't do anything wrong." Uncle Robert stood and came over to the bed. He rested a hand on the rail and looked at me with something like regret in his eyes. "I'll check in again soon," he said. "We'll talk more then." After they left, Jenny stayed behind for a bit. She helped adjust my pillows, refilled my water, and sat quietly beside me. I was tired, but lighter. The words had been said, not all of them maybe, but enough to shift something. Even if it wasn't finished that evening after the meeting with my family, the room felt too quiet. Jenny had stepped out to get coffee, and for the first time all day, I was alone with my thoughts. The steady hum of the monitors was the only sound. Then the door swung open, and Elaine appeared with her weekend bag slung over her shoulders. She didn't say anything at first, just crossed the room and hugged me carefully, mindful of the lines and the tender spots when she sat down on the edge of the bed. She studied my face like she was making sure I was really there. I told her everything, the symptoms, the party, the collapse in the kitchen, the words that had been said in this room only hours earlier. She listened without interrupting, her expression shifting from concern to disbelief to something sharper. When I finished, she shook her head. "They could have killed you," she said quietly, the words landing heavy in the stillness. We talked for a long time about what would happen when I left the hospital. She didn't like the idea of me going back to the apartment over Dad's garage. Not when I was still weak, she reminded me. Her roommate had moved out last month. The second bedroom was empty and waiting. I hesitated, told her I couldn't afford rent yet, not without a job. She brushed it off, said, "We'd figure that out later. For now, the priority was getting me somewhere safe where I could recover without looking over my shoulder at old patterns waiting to repeat." The idea took root slowly. By the time Jenny came back with 2 paper cups, we'd already started making plans. She didn't need convincing. She said she could transfer to a hospital in the city if I wanted company during the move. The next morning, Dr. Winters checked in again. She was pleased with my progress and said if things continued to improve, I could be discharged in a couple of days. She reminded me of the follow-up appointments, the blood thinner schedule, the warning signs to watch for when Dad visited later that afternoon. He stayed in the chair by the window. This time he asked if I needed anything, said he could help with bills while I recovered. I told him I had a place to go. He didn't ask where, just nodded and said he'd help me move my things if I needed it. The day of my discharge was bright and cold, the kind of air that felt sharp in my lungs. Jenny handled the paperwork while Elaine waited outside with her car. The ride to her apartment was quiet, but not uncomfortable. We were both thinking ahead to what came next. Her place was small but bright, with tall windows that caught the afternoon light. She'd already cleared space for my things. The second bedroom had fresh sheets on the bed and a chair by the window that looked out over the street. Jenny moved in a week later after finalizing her transfer. For the first few weeks, I tired easily. Simple things like walking to the corner store or carrying laundry up the stairs left me winded. The medication made me bruise easily, and every unfamiliar ache made me pause. But slowly, I started to build strength. Short walks around the block turned into longer ones. The tightness in my chest eased, and my breath came easier. I set up a desk by the window and started looking for remote work, something that would let me manage my schedule around appointments. By the end of the second month, I had a position as a virtual marketing assistant. The pay was modest, but enough to cover my share of rent and expenses. More importantly, it gave me back a sense of independence I hadn't felt since losing my job. Contact with my family shifted. Dad called occasionally to ask about my health, his tone careful, as if he was still learning how to have that conversation. Grandma called every Sunday, her voice warmer now. She told me she'd started therapy herself to understand the choices she'd made over the years. Marcia never called. Once she sent a generic card with her name signed in the corner, but no message. I didn't respond. Uncle Robert visited twice when he was in the city. He brought coffee and asked questions that showed he'd been paying attention to my recovery. Living with Jenny and Elaine felt different. There was no guessing how my words would land, no weighing whether a symptom was worth mentioning. If I was tired, I could say so. If something hurt, I could take care of it without defending the choice one afternoon in early thaws. Spring. I ran into Dad at the grocery store. He looked older than I remembered, lines deeper at the corners of his eyes. He asked about my job, about how I was feeling, then paused like he was deciding whether to say more. "I've been thinking," he said, "about what happened, about how I handled things." He looked me in the eye and admitted he'd been wrong, not just about that day, but in other ways too. I told him I was still angry, but I appreciated him saying it before we parted. He asked if Jenny and I would come to dinner sometime. I told him maybe I'd think about it as I left. I realized it was the first conversation we'd had in years that didn't leave me holding my breath. Back at the apartment, Jenny was making coffee. She listened while I told her about running into Dad when I finished. She asked if I thought he really meant it. I said, maybe as much as he's capable of right now. A few weeks later, Jenny came home doubled over with abdominal pain. She thought it would pass, but I didn't hesitate. I drove her to the emergency room where they diagnosed appendicitis. We'd caught it before it ruptured, and the surgery went smoothly. As I sat by her bed afterward, I thought about how different it felt to act right away, to believe the first words out of her mouth without questioning them, the way we'd been taught not to. The day after Jenny's surgery, she was sitting up in bed holding a styrofoam cup of broth when my phone rang. The caller ID showed an unfamiliar number. I stepped into the hallway to answer it. Marcia's voice came through quieter than I'd ever heard it. She asked how I was feeling. I told her I was recovering. She hesitated, then said she'd started seeing a therapist, and one of the things she was working on was reaching out to people she had wronged. She admitted she'd said terrible things to me that day in the kitchen, and plenty of times before that she said she had been wrong. I leaned against the wall, unsure what to say. She went on to tell me that my mother would have believed me without hesitation, and that she would have been ashamed to see how things turned out. The mention of my mother stopped me cold. It wasn't something we talked about often. After the call, I went back into Jenny's room. She could tell from my face that something had shifted. I told her Marcia had apologized. Her eyebrows lifted in surprise. She asked if I believed it. I said I wasn't sure, but that hearing it still mattered. Spring turned to early summer, and my follow-up appointments brought good news. Each time my lungs were healing, my oxygen levels were steady, and the swelling in my leg had gone down. I still tired more easily than before, but I could walk longer distances and climb the stairs without stopping halfway at home. Our routines settled. Jenny worked night shifts, so mornings were quiet. I'd make coffee and work at my desk while the sun filled the apartment on her days off. We'd take walks along the park trail, sometimes stopping to watch the rowers on the river. We didn't talk much about that 4th of July, but we didn't need to. The way we handled each other's bad days said enough once a week. Grandma Irene called. She asked about my health, but also about work and what books I was reading. She told me more stories about my mother, how she used to stand her ground when she believed something wasn't right, how she'd once driven through a snowstorm to argue with a school principal on my behalf when I was too young to remember it. One Saturday in late June, Uncle Robert came by with a box of peaches from a roadside stand. We sat in the kitchen slicing them over bowls of vanilla ice cream. He told me he'd spoken to Dad recently, that the subject of me had come up, and that Dad had admitted he'd been wrong, though he hadn't gone into details. Robert said he thought it was worth hearing in person when I was ready. By July, I felt strong enough to travel small trips first to nearby towns for errands, then a weekend visit to see Elaine's parents in Vermont every time I managed something new, without shortness of breath. It felt like reclaiming a piece of my life. One afternoon at the coffee shop near our apartment, I overheard a young woman telling her friend about chest pain she'd had for days. She said her family told her it was just anxiety. I turned in my chair and told her I was sorry to interrupt, but that she should get it checked out. She looked surprised. I shared a little of what had happened to me, enough to make her nod slowly and promise she would. That evening I told Jenny about it while we made dinner. She smiled over her shoulder and said, "Maybe that was the point of all this. Not just getting better, but making sure someone else didn't have to go through it alone." Late that summer, I got another call from Dad. This time he asked directly if I would meet him for lunch. Just the two of us. We chose a small diner halfway between the city and his place. He was already there when I arrived, sitting at a corner booth with his hands wrapped around a mug of coffee he started. By asking about my health, I told him the truth, that I was doing well, that I was getting stronger. Then he took a breath and said he'd been thinking about how things had been between us since Mom died. He admitted he'd been too hard on me, that he'd confused toughness with shutting me down. He said he was sorry for not believing me that day, and for all the times before I listened without interrupting. When he finished, I told him I appreciated hearing it, but that it would take time. He nodded, said he understood, and that he hoped we could try to do better going forward. The check came, and we walked out together into the bright midday sun. It wasn't a complete repair, but it felt like the first solid step when I got back to the apartment. Jenny was at the kitchen table reading through a stack of papers from work. I told her about the lunch. She asked if I thought he meant it. I said I thought he was trying, and for now that was enough. 2 weeks after meeting Dad for lunch, Jenny and I drove back to his place to pick up the last of my boxes. The apartment above the garage looked the same as when I'd left it, cold in winter and stifling in summer. Dad met us outside. He'd cleared space near the door and set the boxes where we could load them quickly. There wasn't much small kitchen items, a few books, a set of towels I'd left behind. He offered to carry the heavier ones down the steps while Jenny and I worked on the rest. There wasn't much talking, just the scrape of cardboard against the railing and the thud of boxes in the trunk. When we finished, he leaned against the side of the car and asked if we had time to come inside for coffee. I looked at Jenny. She gave a small nod, so we followed him in. The kitchen smelled faintly of fresh grounds. He poured 3 mugs and sat across from us, his hands wrapped around the cup. He said he'd been thinking about how fast things could have gone differently that day in July, that if Jenny hadn't called when she did, he might be telling another story entirely. His eyes didn't meet mine when he said it, but the words hung between us in a way they never had before. We stayed about an hour, the conversation drifting from my health to Jenny's new schedule to the state of his vegetable garden. It wasn't warm exactly, but it wasn't tense either when we left. He walked us to the car and told me to call if I needed anything. It was a simple offer, but one he hadn't made in years. Back in the city, life kept its rhythm. My remote work kept me busy. And Jenny's shifts varied enough that some weeks we only crossed paths over quick meals in the kitchen. In late August, Elaine and I went to a street fair near the river. She introduced me to a neighbor from her building, a woman named Claire, who was new to the area. We sat on a bench with lemonade while the music played behind us. Claire asked about the scar on my arm from where the IV had been. I told her the short version of what happened. She listened intently, then told me her younger sister was having health issues. Their parents were brushing off. She didn't know how to convince them to take it seriously. I told her what Jenny had done for me and how it had made the difference. She nodded slowly and said she'd try to be that person for her sister, even if no one else was. September brought cooler mornings. I could walk to the park without feeling winded. The leaves started to turn along the path near the river. Jenny and I made a habit of walking there on her days off. Sometimes we talked about small things, groceries, schedules, weekend plans. Other times the conversation drifted back to the family and where things stood now. One evening she mentioned that Grandma had asked if we'd consider coming for Thanksgiving, just a small gathering. Not the big extended family dinner, I told her. I'd think about it, but wasn't ready to decide yet. She didn't push. We both knew some doors could open again, but not all at once. In early October, I got a letter in the mail. The return address was Marcia's. It wasn't long, just a page written in neat, careful handwriting. She wrote that therapy had made her reconsider how she'd treated me over the years, that she was sorry for every time she'd used my sensitivity as a weapon. She didn't ask for a reply, only said she hoped I was doing well. I set the letter on the counter and left it there for a few days before tucking it into a drawer. Mid-month, I had my final scheduled follow-up with Dr. Winters. She walked me through the results of my scans and blood work. Everything looked good, she said. I could begin tapering off the medication over the next few months, as long as I kept up with routine check-ins. I left the hospital that day feeling lighter than I had in a long time. A week later, Jenny and I went to the farmer's market on Saturday morning. We wandered past stands of apples, squash, and jars of honey. At one table, a woman was describing symptoms to the vendor: shortness of breath, dizziness swelling in her leg. I caught Jenny's eye, and we both paused after she paid for her vegetables. Jenny stepped forward and told her it might be worth seeing a doctor soon. I nodded in agreement, sharing that I'd had something similar and that getting checked had made all the difference. She thanked us and promised she would. Walking back to the car, I realized how natural it had felt to speak up. Now, not with fear or hesitation, but with the certainty that some warnings shouldn't be ignored. By mid-November, the days were shorter and the air carried that crisp edge that hinted at the first frost. Jenny and I had been walking in the park less often, trading it for coffee at the small diner near her place. One afternoon, over a shared slice of pumpkin pie, she brought up Thanksgiving again. She said Grandma had called to ask if we might stop by for dessert, just the three of us. No cousins, no aunts, no big table to navigate. I thought about it for a moment before telling her yes, not because everything was fixed, but because it felt like a step I was ready to take. On Thanksgiving night, Jenny drove us out after dinner at my apartment. Grandma's porch light was on a warm glow against the cold air. She hugged me first, holding on a little longer than she used to. Inside, she'd set out pie coffee and a small vase of chrysanthemums on the table. The conversation stayed gentle. We talked about her garden, the changes in town, and small memories from when Jenny and I were kids. No one mentioned July. No one needed to. It wasn't a full repair, but it was a beginning. In early December, I sent Marcia a short card thanking her for her letter. I didn't promise anything, but I wanted her to know I'd read it. Whether she writes again or not, I've made my peace with it. Life has a way of layering the past and present until they blend. The hurt doesn't disappear, but it softens. I've learned that sometimes justice isn't about winning or proving a point. It's about reclaiming your own place in the world without needing anyone's permission. When I walk by the river now, I think about the people who crossed my path this year: Jenny, who refused to look away; Elaine, who opened her door without asking for anything; Claire, who wanted to protect her sister; and even strangers at a farmer's market who listened to a warning. All those moments thread together into something steady and unshakable. If you've ever been made to feel small in your own story, I hope you remember this. You can still write the ending. And sometimes it's the quiet chapters that matter most. Thank you for walking through mine with me. If it stayed with you, share it with someone who might need to hear it too.